Edgar Quero is the latest White Sox rookie to not get the recognition he deserves, although maybe his rookie season was a bit overrated.
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm your host, Todd Welter, lifelong Sox fan. I've been podcasting here for over a year and a half and covering the team well before then. And also, I've covered Major League Baseball for outlets such as the Associated Press. And thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Bleacher reports Joel Reuter put out his top 50 rookies of the season, and he excluded catcher Edgar Quero. So let's discuss if he was right to do that, along with one surprise name he had on the list. Then let's discuss the case Jim Margulis of SoxMachine.com made for Mike Tauchman possibly not getting tendered. And finally, let's do a throwback Thursday since I didn't get to way back Wednesday yesterday. And let's revisit that glorious ALDS win over Boston 20 years ago. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. All right, so first it was Shane Smith not making Baseball America's all-rookie team. And now it's Edgar Quero not making Bleacher Report's Joel Reuter's top 50 rookies of the season. And I know Bleacher Report is more about doing aggregation content lately, but Reuter's been one of the few writers that they still have that does legit coverage of the prospects, does the research. I at least respect what he puts out. And I'm a bit surprised that Reuter neglected Quero, who he considered the White Sox fourth best prospect in his 2024 year-end of rankings for the White Sox. He had him as a top, he had him as a tier one prospect. So I was a little surprised that Quero doesn't make his top 50 rookies. But one name that surprised me was Sean Burke. Sean Burke was among his top 50 rookies. He ranked Burke the 43rd best rookie. And while I did make the case, I think it was last Friday when I talked about Shane Smith not making Baseball America's all-rookie team, and one of the reasons is the White Sox had 100 losses. And when it comes to narrowing down that tight, yeah, when you lose that many games, you're going to be hard-pressed to get the recognition for all your rookies because your team was full of some promising rookies this year that came together to form a core that provides a promising future. Now, when it comes to a top 50 list, though, record doesn't matter, and usually the best teams and the contenders don't have a ton of rookies. So that's why Burke joining 5 other White Sox, that's not a total surprise, but Quero not making the list kind of surprised me. But then if you read some of his criteria of why he has, he put together this top 50 list, maybe he was right in leaving Quero off the list. And I thought to myself, maybe, am I thinking a bit too high on Quero? Have I bought way too much stock into Edgar Quero? Because one of Reuter's criteria was finishing the season strong. And well, Quero's September wasn't great. And also, no player, as I went up and down the list to double check and triple check, no player on his list had a negative F4. And Quero finished with a minus 0.2. But I'm still going to be high on Quero because, if he can, especially, there's room for him to grow. And especially if he can provide the power like he had in the minors, then I'm glad that I'm not selling my figurative stock that I have in the young catcher. Now, for who else was on the White Sox, in Reuter's list, the 5 other players, you got infielder Chase Mydroth checking in at 41. Pitcher Mike Vassell, he was ranked 38th. Catcher Kyle Teal was ranked 19th, and shortstop Colson Montgomery was ranked 9th. And then pitcher Shane Smith was ranked 8th. And Reuter actually ranked Smith ahead of Chad Patrick, Cam Schlittler, and Will Warren, the 3 pitchers Baseball America put ahead of Shane Smith on their all-rookie team. So again, it just goes to show you that different publications, different, rookie and prospect experts are going to look at things just a little bit differently there. He had Smith pretty high up. I think he was like the second highest ranked pitcher that he had on the list. But I was a little surprised to see Burke's name there, considering he was demoted in August, and he didn't exactly have an amazing September. He had a 4.32 ERA, and he ate up to 16 2/3 innings in 4 outings, 2 of which he was spotted in an opener. And I was at the game, against the Padres, and I think he only made it through 3 2/3 innings. He was not crisp. The command is still an issue. Although Burke still struck out 23, and I do like what Reuter wrote about Burke. Burke had a 1.42 ERA in 19 innings as a September call-up in 2024 that earned a spot in the White Sox rotation this past spring. He logged 7 quality starts while ranking 6th among pitchers with 134 1/3 innings pitched, and he should at least be a useful innings eater while the Southsiders continue to build back toward contention. An inning eater is going to be needed. And if Burke can become that, that's going to be huge because the White Sox are going to be limited spenders. And you can only pencil in Smith and Davis Martin into this rotation. So you're probably going to still need Burke to be one of the 3 additional pitchers the White Sox need to have in the rotation next season. They're going to need him to eat innings, but they need him to do it effectively. And to do that, he has to work on his command. He must command his pitches better. Now, when it comes to the lowest F4 player that Reuter put on his list, it was Agustin Ramirez, the Marlins catcher DH. He had a 0 F4, and you could make the case that, well, Quero had the better average because Ramirez only had a 231 average. But you can see why he makes the list over Quero because Ramirez had a 413 slugging percentage and 21 home runs. Quero had a 356 slug and 5 home runs total. That lack of pop, the negative F4, along with a 218 average and a 543 OPS in September is probably why he's off the list. If I had to make the case between Ramirez and Quero, and I'm using that criteria, I'm probably going to put Ramirez on the list just because, again, had just a tick better F4, and he provided more power from a position where you want some power. Although to show you the difference between Fangraphs WAR and Baseball Reference WAR, B WAR, Quero was a 1.2. And I mentioned that just in case some of you are getting worried that a 22-year-old catcher is trending in the wrong direction. F4 and B WAR, they just calculate a little bit more differently. I do go with F4 because I do think it takes everything into account. And there's sometimes you look at somebody's B WAR and you're like, yeah, that doesn't match up to the eye test. I think F4 kind of matches a little bit more up to not only marrying the eye test, but again, measuring your overall game. And I'm not panicked by this exclusion or the negative F4 because the eye test shows he has very good bat to ball skills, but he is the poster boy of what the front office and manager Will Venable wants to accomplish in the offseason and next season, and that's internal improvement. Quero can get better. He can get better in the power numbers. His 333 on base percentage is nice, but he could get, his walk percentage up just a little bit more from 7.9, and he's done that in the minors. He had like an 8% walk percentage last year at AA, goes up to AAA, and it goes up to 11%. Although I do think it's tough for him to increase his walk percentage just because he does put the ball in play a lot more. He had a BABIP of 338 at AAA last year, 432 at AAA this year, and then 320 at the majors. Because again, he's trying to make contact. And, maybe if he is a bat to ball skills guy, White Sox lineup needs that, but you still want power. And he has had that power. He has it for power in the minors. Not a lot of power, but a decent amount of pop. And the power's got to come along with, I know I've been preaching it, but he has to get better hitting with runners in scoring position. And he's got to get better barreling up the ball. He had just a 3.7% barrel rate. And his catching metrics such as framing, and I hate how that's a thing. I will always hate that. And the caught stealing above average, that has to grow too. But again, the reason why I would say don't sell your stock on him is he's just 22. And he won't turn 23 until a few days into the 2026 season. So that's why I'm still holding on to my shares of Edgar Quero stock. Well, holding on to Mike Tauchman might not be so clear-cut as Jim Margulis of SoxMachine.com made some interesting points as to why he might not get a contract tendered in the offseason. And let's discuss that after the break. What do you get when you have a bald eagle standing on top of a silverback gorilla riding a T-Rex? Confidence, pure confidence. And if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet Rugiet Go Long. That's exactly where Rugiet Go Long comes in. This isn't just another ED pill. It's a total game changer for confidence. Go Long combines 2 doctor-trusted medications in one dual-action formula so you can get hard and go the distance. The effects can last up to 36 hours. That's confidence all day, all night, and even into the next day. And the process is simple. Connect with a board-certified doctor, 100% online, and if prescribed, your treatment ships discreetly right to your door. And hey, your neighbors don't need to know your confidence secrets. But if they ask, hey, we've been hearing something that sounds like a bald eagle standing on top of a silverback gorilla riding a T-Rex, you can tell them, no, no, no. What you're hearing is the confidence that comes from Rugiet Go Long. Ready to level up your confidence in the bedroom? Head to Rugiet.com. That's Rugiet.com and use promo code LOCKEDONMLB for 15% off your first order. That's Rugiet.com, promo code LOCKEDONMLB. And make sure to use our code so they know we sent you. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox. And if you can't catch the show on YouTube, you can get the audio version of the show on places such as Apple or Spotify. So make sure to follow or subscribe at wherever you get your podcasts. Either way, get your 30-minute fix of Chicago White Sox baseball venting with me and maybe some hope. And also make sure to check out my written content at SouthsideSox.com, on TapSportsNet.com, and at the Fans First Sports Network. So I've made my position clear. I think Mike Tauchman is the perfect bridge in right field until Brady Montgomery is hopefully ready to take over by the trade deadline next season. I mean, I think that would be great if Braden is ready by August to make his debut. And I think that's kind of should be what they're aiming for. Kind of like what they did with Colson. Now, obviously, Braden's got to stay healthy and he's got to overcome some of those strikeout struggles. But you've seen him have a little bit of struggles after getting, he got hot at high A, kind of struggled a little bit at double A, but had some really good at bats, I think. And I definitely think he reaches stud status. I'm very hopeful, and I'm very hopeful that he is finally the team's long-term right fielder because they've been trying to replace Jermaine Dye since Jermaine Dye retired in 2009. But even if Montgomery needs a full season in the minors, I think Tauchman's professional at bats is good enough to have to cover a full season until the team's top prospect is ready to take over right field on opening day of 2027. So I think those are the two timelines you got to look at. Is he going to be ready to take over right field by either the trade deadline of 2026 or opening day of 2027? I think that's kind of what they're also aiming for as an organization. However, I do acknowledge Tauchman's legs, they may not hold up for a full season, much like they didn't this season. Remember, he only played in like 93 games. He spent a lot of time on the injured list, and then he ended the season on the injured list with a torn meniscus. And the limited at-bats, because of the injuries, may not make financial sense to actually pay him his projected $3.4 million in ARB, according to MLB trade rumors. Now, I know SpotTrack has it at 2.5, but MLB trade rumors is, they use a different formula that sometimes can be a little bit more accurate. So at $3.4 million, that's what they're suggesting. And SoxMachine.com's Jim Margulis, he made the excellent point that if the White Sox do their accounting right, like they kind of did with Kevin Pillar, they might realize they don't need to pay Tauchman $3.4 million, that what he provided is not worth $3.4 million on the market. And James Fegan, he's also got a great piece that he just posted about the White Sox maybe needing to overhaul their outfield. But I kind of actually want to focus on Jim's work, in part because it was a free version where Jim's, you got to subscribe. And I know SoxMachine.com is using those subscription dollars to send James, to out-of-town games. So that way we can have coverage of the White Sox beyond, the Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune. Because, again, the Athletic decided to lay off James and not really cover the White Sox, even though they have 2 beat reporters for the Cubs. And I get why, but still, it's just you should be covering, a major market team. So I do want to more focus on Jim's piece. And also because I like the tie-in that he has with Kevin Pillar and why, again, the White Sox maybe did, might be penny pitching, kind of what they did with Kevin Pillar in 2024. All right, so here's what he writes. Here's a few paragraphs I want to share. Tauchman's the most interesting one, if only because of a profile that has made the White Sox walk the narrow path between praising his presence on the 2025 roster without guaranteeing his spot on the 2026 team. Chris Getz has routinely stopped short of commitment when asked about Tauchman's status, the most recent example being his year-end press conference on September 17th. Quote, Tauch's been really good. He brings a consistent at-bat. He's had some nagging injuries that he's played through, which is certainly appreciated. I think it's good for our clubhouse to see a guy at this stage of his career fight the way that he does. But most importantly, he's been a productive player. He's a guy that you target. He's a guy that you target players like that. We'll have our conversations with Tauch and his group, and certainly open-minded in bringing him back in some capacity. End quote. Margolis continues to write. Tauchman's estimated salary explains the White Sox recidivance. By rate stats, Tauchman had the second best season of his career, 263, 356, 400, but it's not worlds better than his performance for the Cubs in 2024 when he hit 248, 357, 366 while playing in 109 games. Tauchman was projected to earn $2.9 million, but the Cubs non-tendered him, which created the opportunity for the White Sox to sign him for a hair less than $2 million. This time around, Tauchman is in line for an estimated $3.4 million salary coming off an age 34 season that was plagued by leg injuries and ended early with a torn meniscus. So it seems like all parties are preparing for a similar cycle, where Tauchman's IRB raise is higher than the market value, but he's still a major league contributor somewhere. Perhaps that somewhere is still on the south side, but talking it up too much before the tender deadline would probably be dangling a price that they're probably not willing to pay. It's reminiscent of how the White Sox signed Kevin Pillar to a minor league contract over the 2023-2024 offseason, only to realize in spring training that Pillar's market price was below the original $3 million major league option they agreed to. They corrected the books on their end by releasing Pillar, then re-signing him for $1 million. But if I'm picking up what he put down on Twitter a few days ago, it doesn't sound like Pillar appreciated the audit. And the kind of what Margolis shared was Pillar was taking questions from followers and that type of stuff, and they asked him what teams he roots against that he played for, and he said it was the team I had the shortest tenure with, and I'm glad I'm gone. Now, again, before you're like, oh, see, there's another player ragging on the former player ragging on the White Sox. Remember, Pillar was there when Pedro Grifol was still the manager, so that's when it was definitely still a dumpster fire. Again, you're not hearing too much about how things are awful under Will Venable, for example. And I know it's pinching pennies, but this is the White Sox we're talking about, obviously. And while I still maintain there is going to be money to spend in the offseason, even if they have the same payroll as last season or even slightly less, it's still not a ton of money to spend. One moment for a second. I got to hit the cough button here. And I do think one of the starting pitchers that they must add has to be more in that 1 year. And again, they got to stick to the 1 year or 1 year in an option market because you got to keep spots open for Noah Schultz, Hagen Smith, Tanner McDougal, or Shane Murphy in the rotation eventually. But it's got to be in that 1 year or one in an option, 7 to 10 million range. Martin Perez pitched well, but, on that 3.5 million range, that under 5 million range that they were shopping in, that's usually you're getting potential injury issues or an effectiveness like Chris Flexen you got in 2024. So I just want a better starter next season, one that's more polished and one that could possibly be dealt at the deadline to get something decent back. Because again, the White Sox don't have a ton of trade assets. You want to be able to get another starting, another return, kind of like what you got even for Adrian Hauser. So if you're committing that, to filling the budget of 20 to 25 million that you have in the hole in the budget, you're still going to need another starting pitcher. So you got to at least add 2 starting pitchers in the offseason. You got to add some bullpen upgrades and then possibly an upgrade at first or DH. And I still think they need to be all in on Japanese first baseman Munetaka Murakami. Then, yeah, you need to find ways to make sure you have the maximum dollars within the budget to make those purchases. And yes, I would love an unlimited budget, but we're not going to get it. So maybe you do non-tender Tauchman with the idea of circling back and asking him, hey, maybe you come back in the 2 million range, since he does seem to want to stay in Chicago. He didn't want to be traded at the deadline for family reasons. And it's kind of the same concept with Martin Perez. You pay him his 1.5 million buyout and then circle back to see if he'll come back on a similar deal that he had this past season, maybe a 3.5 and another 1.5 million buyout. And I know it's frustrating to talk about pinching pennies, but in the case of Tauchman, who I love, you got to wonder, can his legs hold up? And does it maybe make more sense to bring back Austin Slater at probably another 1.5 million to hit lefties and then platoon them with Brooks Baldwin? Or do you even go cheaper and say Baldwin and Corey Julks for half the season until Braden Montgomery's coming up? I would only be okay, though, if they do get rid of Tauchman or non-tender him and try to bring him back at a cheaper deal, if they actually use then that budget space that they're trying to create to spend on a quality starting pitcher on a one-year deal, at least one decent bullpen arm, and getting Murakami. Otherwise, I think it's just a waste of time. And I think then that penny pinching is just being way too frugal. Well, since I had Fitz from the Barroom Network on the show yesterday, I didn't get to Way Back Wednesday, so let's do Throwback Thursday and go over the White Sox first playoff series win since 1917 when the Pale Hose beat the Red Sox in the 2005 ALDS on their way to winning the World Series. And that happened 20 years ago this week. So let's discuss this next on Locked On White Sox. There's nothing like catching a baseball game live. The energy, the crowd, the chance to see your team in person. But actually getting tickets, that's the tough part. Queues, login screens, surprise fees. It takes all the fun out of it. That's why I use Game Time, the app that gives the advantage back to fans. Game Time is fast, easy, and backed by the Game Time guarantee. You'll always get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. Plus, all fees are included. So the price you see is the price you pay. And think about it. Fees are included. So you're going to know your total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. And how many times you thought, hey, I'm going to get a great deal to this show, to this sporting event, to this performance, only to get to the checkout and see that deal vanish under a pile of fees. Well, that doesn't happen at Game Time. And honestly, Game Time is faster, cheaper, and less stressful than any other way that I've bought tickets. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, shout out to all the everydayers. I appreciate your loyalty. Please hit the like button on today's episode. Recommend to your fellow Sox fans or baseball fans, friends, to subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox, or wherever they get their podcasts, as the show's available on all major podcast platforms. Well, 20 years ago this week, us White Sox fans were still enjoying the high of the Sox knocking off the defending World Series champions, Boston Red Sox, and in sweep fashion. That's right. Not only did the White Sox win their first playoff series since 1917 during the 2005 ALDS, but they did it in sweep fashion against everybody's darling, the Boston Red Sox, who were coming off snapping their own World Series curse. You know, the curse of the Bambino. And the White Sox dominated Game 1, which was actually a sign of the run the Southsiders are about to go on, because it's one of the most dominant World Series runs that you'll ever see. Probably one of the most underrated World Series runs. And if it was up to ESPN, it never happened. The White Sox didn't win the 2005 World Series. Got canceled, just like the 1994 World Series. One that the White Sox would have won. And I'll die on that hill, too, that they were going to beat the Montreal Expos. I still think the Atlanta Braves could have snuck in. But either way, that was the White Sox year, 1994. But again, the strike wiped it out because of the owner leading, the White Sox owner leading that charge. But they come back to win Game 2. Again, another sign of things to come, as they won a few of the games on the way to the World Series in comeback fashion. And then they get one of the best relief appearances, in my opinion, in Game 3. And yes, I'm going to die on that hill that El Duque's Game 3 relief appearance with bases loaded, no outs, and getting out of that jam was one of the best pieces of relief pitching you will ever see in a postseason game. I'm going to die on that hill. I will defend it. I don't care what you come back out with me. And coming back in Game 2 against David Wells was also just so satisfying, considering how much of that 2001 trade turned out to be just so poorly that the White Sox made. Now, obviously, it turned out to actually just be net neutral because Mike Soroka never pitched for the Toronto Blue Jays. But David Wells was supposed to put the White Sox over the top, and he couldn't keep himself enough shape, and he kept pointing out everything that was wrong with the White Sox and didn't do anything that, it was basically a wash. Although him always criticizing the organization now seems like a prophecy at the time, what he was doing. Anyways, winning game 1, 14-2 was just the best because it came after that stressful September where the White Sox almost allowed Cleveland to catch them in the standings. Remember, Cleveland was a game and a half back at one point, and the White Sox had that huge lead. So the White Sox didn't do what the Detroit Tigers did this year, where, they had that massive lead and then gave it back to Cleveland. They were able to, push them off, and then they were able to keep Cleveland out of the playoffs. That was even more astonishing. And plus, the White Sox organization was on a 5-game postseason losing streak after losing Game 5 and Game 6 in the 1993 ALCS to Toronto and then getting swept in the 2000 ALDS to the Mariners. So finally winning a playoff game for the first time in 12 years was a huge relief. It was like, hey, this organization could actually win a playoff game. And especially from 2002 to 2004, you kept not even being able to make the playoffs because of the darn Twins getting in the way and the White Sox not being able to win at the Humpty Dump. And then you have that 5-run 5th inning off of David Wells in Game 2 with Aaron Rowan driving in Carl Everett, Joe Crede singling in Rowan, and then Tadahito Iguchi hitting that 3-run blast off of Wells to complete the Sox, erasing a 4-0 deficit, and they go on to win Game 2. And, I admit I loved it when the White Sox got Wells in 2001, but then I was also one of those White Sox fans that just grew disgusted with him. It was just a terrible look for Wells when he was questioning Frank Thomas's heart and his ability to play when it turned out, yeah, Frank was actually legitimately hurt in 2001. And then Wells, he's lost for the season with a bad back, trying to field a ground ball. It's just, I'm glad that Wells is just Wells' White Sox career is just a footnote for him because it didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. And again, it spoke to the White Sox not going out and making that huge pitching move until they got Freddie Garcia. And then there's El Duque, Orlando Hernandez's heroics in Game 3 in the bottom of the 6th. It was getting tense after Manny Ramirez cut the White Sox lead to 1, 4-3 when he hits that home run off of Freddie Garcia. And then Damaso Marte, he loads the bases with a hit and 2 walks. So you got no outs, and the Red Sox primed for a huge inning. And then El Duque happens. And to me, he's one of the best postseason pitchers ever. The stuff that he did with the Yankees. But then he comes on. He gets Veritek to hit that pop fly into first base foul territory for out number 1. Then he gets Tony Graffinino to pop out the short. And then he finally strikes out Johnny Damon swinging. And what is amazing is how he kept 2 Boston hitters from not even putting the ball in the air enough to even get a tie game RBI sacrifice fly, or to make sure no grounders were hit for a potential, play at the plate going wrong with the infield coming in, or, okay, you settle for a double play while allowing the tying run to score because you'll take the 2 outs. He got the outs he exactly needed to get to keep the White Sox ahead. That's what was even more impressive. And then the Sox add the insurance run in the 9th. They win Game 3 5-3, and they win their first playoff series since 1917. Well, that wraps up this edition of Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day. For your second listen, check out Locked On MLB Game Night, every game, every night until a World Series champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find MLB Game Night on Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. And I'll be back tomorrow with a fan poll Friday. Feel free to leave comments about today's discussion on the episode page on YouTube via email lockedonwhitesox@gmail.com, or leave them at X, formerly Twitter, @LockedOnSox or @ToddJDub. Also, make sure to like today's episode on YouTube and leave a 5-star review at wherever you get your podcast. Have a great day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.